All right, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming. It is now 12 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Tony Pankush. My pronouns are they, them. I am the Education and Outreach Coordinator here at the Center for the History of Psychology. Today we are hosting this panel discussion focused on the subject of misinformation and disinformation. And I am delighted to welcome our four panelists who are representing four different fields here at the University of Akron, hopefully bring some different perspectives on this subject. And to get us started, I will go ahead and have these panelists introduce themselves. So you're welcome to start. Seems like Melanie has the microphone closest to her, if you'd like to begin.
Let me see. It's on? It's on, okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Melanie McGurr from the University Libraries, and I'm the Associate Dean of Technical Services there.
Hi, I'm Dr. Greg Wilson. I'm in the History Department and Director of the Graduate Program in Applied History there.
I'm Kathy Fay. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for the History of Psychology, and I am Associate Professor of Research in the Department of Psychology.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Gary Holliday. My pronouns are he, they, and I am Director of the School of Education, the LeBron James Family Foundation School of Education. I only say that once, so memorize that. I am also a Professor of Science Education, and my area of interest in terms of research is science communication.
Thank you all so much for being here. So the way this will be structured is we'll have about 30 to 40 minutes of discussion, and then we will open it up to Q&A towards the end. So if y'all have any burning questions, feel free to save those for the end, and we'll make sure that the panelists address them. So to begin the conversation today, we're going to spend a lot of time throwing around the terms misinformation and disinformation. Could one of you quickly define the difference between these two terms for the audience?
Well, I have the talking stick in my hand, so I guess it's me. So as I mentioned, I've been delving into science communication over the last few years, and so I've been looking at what is communication and communication theory. So just kind of bringing it down to brass tacks, it's basically you need several components, right? You need a sender of the communication, the actual message, and then the receiver. So in this case, hopefully, I am the sender. I am sending out some messages to you guys who are the receivers. So along the way, though, there could be interferences or noise that kind of disrupts the message or the messaging. It also depends on the context. It depends on the clarity of my message. It depends on your receiving and your understanding of whatever content may be involved. So there's lots of places where miscommunication or discommunication could occur. However, with miscommunication, I think the intent there is not there to deceive anybody. It just might be a misstatement of a word or not being clear. Discommunication, there is intent to deceive. And so that's where I see the differences. Do you want to add anything? Sure.
So as a librarian, I brought a book, because that's what we do. And I have to give credit to Dr. DeChambeau at the library. She let me know about this. So this is a book by Barbara McQuaid, who some of you may follow on social media, How Disinformation is Sabotaging America, Attack from Within. And so she has a really brief definition. I'll be donating this to the library after I'm done with it, just FYI. Disinformation is the deliberate use of lies to manipulate people, whether to extract profit or to advance a political agenda. Its unwitting accomplice, misinformation, is spread by unknowing dupes who repeat lies they believe to be true. And I won't go on because it gets a little political after that, but that's the definition that I was kind of rolling with.
All right, so sort of first question beyond. Oh, Kathy, did you have something else to say?
I just wanted to add one thing to that.
Don't give academics microphones.
That's right. Which is that, just from the standpoint of psychology at least, we don't think so hard about the difference between misinformation and disinformation because both are false information. the intent may be different, but within the field of psychology, we tend to be really focused on what can you do to combat misinformation and disinformation. And it doesn't actually matter what the intent of the sender was in this case, right? What matters, at least it matters less. What matters is, how people are going to interpret that information, whether they're going to believe it, whether they're going to pass it on. So it's kind of interesting when I read this question. I thought, okay, the intent of disinformation is there. You're spreading something knowing that it is a falsehood. But from the standpoint of combating it, it might not actually matter that little whether there was intention behind it or not.
All right, so sort of moving on to the next question. We've seen a rise in misinformation and disinformation in recent years. From each of your perspectives, how has this development impacted your respective fields of research and work?
So again, I'm coming from the perspective of science and science education. And just to back up a little bit, so my background before coming to the University of Akron in 2011, it's been 13 years, I was a science teacher, middle level high school. I taught in schools in New York City and Chicago, but I also spent a lot of time teaching in museums and museum settings. So I have that kind of context of, how is information, science information, communicated via an exhibit or an exhibition, with curators making decisions as to what is being presented. So there is that piece of it, but then I also am interested in scientists and how they work and how the development of scientific knowledge emerges. And over the years, there has been a general, and it seems more so now than ever, a general distrust of scientists. They can't make up their mind. They're always changing, what they say. It's all theory. It's all theory. So it's just kind of a general misunderstanding of how science works and the process of science. And going back to museum settings in the past, historically, it really focused on the products of science and scientific inquiry. So my approach over the years is really helping people to understand the process. So when they are presented with, a study or a little news bite, they have the literacy skills to be able to investigate more. So that is a piece of it. But then there's also this general, if you think about how information is being conveyed. In the past, we relied on the fourth estate or news media. Now, of course, is the fifth estate, which is social media. And in that platform, there is this pseudo-symmetry that occurs. And it's true for any field, not just in science, where the expert's opinion has equal weight as the quote-unquote non-expert. So kind of going back to what Kathy was saying in terms of the message being sent out and conveyed, so there's equal weight in both sides. And there could be more than two sides, but that pseudo-symmetry is occurring as well, especially in social media. So I'll stop there.
I think about this from the standpoint of psychology, but I think about it more from the standpoint of history of science. And I think it's really interesting. We're talking about misinformation a lot right now, and we're talking about disinformation a lot, but this is actually a problem we've been trying to solve or at least address in some way for a long, long time. So psychology particularly, it's interesting. Just last year, the American Psychological Association issued a resolution and a public report and a whole bunch of press releases really focused on misinformation and how to combat misinformation. And that came out of the pandemic, really. I mean, also politics, but really it was in the wake of the pandemic when we really saw the impact that misinformation and disinformation can have when you're dealing with a really, really important and ambiguous situation, right? The pandemic is a really good example of this. This is something that was highly important to everybody. And the information that we had there was almost too much of it, and we were constantly trying to sort through that information. And a lot of it was ambiguous, and it was constantly changing. So psychologists really started to focus on the situation and what was causing people to spread misinformation, believe misinformation, things like this. But from my standpoint, it was really interesting because what feels like a long time ago, I wrote an article on misinformation during the Second World War and how psychologists were addressing misinformation during the Second World War. It was the same thing. And they came up with this idea of rumors spread in situations that are highly important and highly ambiguous. They called it the rumor formula, R equals I times A. And then we like to try to quantify these things, so then they tried to actually quantify it. It didn't work so well. That's another story. But that's the thing that, it sounds a bit pessimistic, but when the pandemic came around and psychologists began sort of refocusing on misinformation, to me, it just looked like old wine in new bottles, because it was kind of the same intractable problem that we had been trying to address in the same ways in the Second World War. Not to say we haven't made any progress, we definitely had. Not to say the situations are identical. I mean, social media has just changed this game in really meaningful ways. But I guess that's the thing that I really thought about during the pandemic, is we've been here before. We've tried, and a lot of the things that they tried to do in the Second World War, for example, setting up rumor clinics and rumor control units. They did this during the Second World War. FEMA did it during COVID. They set up a rumor dashboard on their website. And they've done this during natural disasters. They've done it over and over again. And then they were all surprised to sort of find that doesn't actually work that well. But had they, looked, so it's interesting to me from a history of science perspective in that way, to just see how our fields keep trying to address these things. And we make progress, but I think that we also tried the same things over and over again without great results.
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, I was thinking of COVID as well. Just to piggyback on that, was it last year? I think last couple of years. I teach a Ohio history course, and the project we did in that course with students was to use this wonderful digital site on the 1918-1919 flu pandemic. And what the site has done, it's out of the University of Michigan, they've collected newspaper stories from across the country, right, dealing with 1918, 1919. And then we zeroed in on Ohio, and I had them pick 3 cities and look at sort of what newspapers were reporting, right, about the pandemic and how they were reporting it. So, and exactly what you were saying, they found stories about, what were the recommendations from the experts at the time? Well, put a cloth mask on, don't spit in spittoons, so that we don't have spittoons now, but distance yourself, go outside, right? So it was really interesting to see that in the midst of a pandemic in 1918, a lot of the advice, a lot of similar things were coming forward in 2020, but also a lot of the same opposition was there, right? The government can't tell us to shut down our church. The government can't tell us to shut down our saloons, right? We should be able to go to the movies, all these types of things. Sounds the same, right? So it was interesting, again, to think, in that moment, how Ohioans in this case, but Americans generally, were saying and reacting in very similar ways to what they said and did in 2020, 2021. And at least initially, a lot of the medical advice was also very similar. Turns out some of it was good, some of it was bogus, right? But it was a similar way. And then again, health authorities were trying to get the word out about combating misinformation, what's true, what's not. So anyway, it's again, we like to say history repeats itself. It's a bit of a cliche, but in some ways, we can see that. And again, the history of disinformation, misinformation is a long and sordid tale, and so, we can go back in time before, our 100 years here and think about how those episodes have happened. There's stories about, disinformation campaigns in Rome to discredit Mark Antony and get Augustus Caesar in power, for example. So, we can go back even further probably. So again, it's been around, right? And as you say, I think scale and scope maybe are different, right? We have social media now, which amplifies things, in an instant. So that's a big difference there. One of the things a couple of things I'll mention here. Sam Weinberg, I don't know if anybody is familiar with his work. He does a lot of history of education and looks at kind of trying to teach historical thinking. So what does that mean? It means, reading closely, reading carefully, looking for evidence, corroboration, right? All the things that historians do, trying to see how we do that in classrooms and can we do it better. So just a short thing on Sam Weinberg's career. He's now at Stanford, and he conducted a very recent research on civic reasoning with these ideas in mind about misinformation, disinformation. So, and I want to read a couple of things from his research, which might give us hope or not. He says, quote, this is one of the studies they did, Civic Online Reasoning, a National Portrait. And so he said, quote, this was, experiment with high school students, so thousands of high school students. Quote, 2/3 of students were unable to distinguish between news stories and ads despite being labeled sponsored content, and 52% of students believed a grainy video that claimed to show ballot stuffing in the 2016 Democratic primaries constituted strong evidence of voter fraud in the United States, when in fact it was a video filmed in Russia. Now, not to bash students, because he then did another experiment where historians didn't come out so well either. He said, quote, he basically had fact checkers who do fact checks for news media, historians, and students. And we're like, oh, who's going to win this battle, right, of who gets it? Well, apparently the fact checkers win. Yeah, and it's interesting because, and again, we can go into, how that, but basically, what he found is that fact checkers read what he calls laterally, right? Historians were taught to read deeply. So basically what happened is historians got on the site he gave them, they stayed on the site and they read it deeply, they read it carefully, and at the end they said, this seems pretty legitimate, right? Even though it was completely bogus. So we can be fooled too, right? But what fact checkers did is they read laterally. In other words, they said, okay, this looks interesting, let me check that. So they went and pulled up other tabs, found other sites. Basically, they did their due diligence like we should all do when we are confronted with something. And of course, the fact checker said, oh, no, this is, created by, a bot or, something else. So, so the historians, we're academics, we should know better. Well, maybe not in this case, right? Confronted with social media at least. So sometimes deep critical thinking and reasoning may not be the way to do it. You have to read and think in a different way, laterally, as Sam Weinberg said. So I thought that was interesting as well. One more point about this. I think what Weinberg's proposing and what I think a lot of things you hear is that, well, it's up to us, right, individually, to do better, right? We need to read laterally or fact check or do whatever. And I think that's certainly true, and I would encourage all of us to do that. But I think a number of scholars are pointing this out, that as we talked about scale and scope now, the difference is that the structures that are out there in society are so deep, so deeply wedded, and so powerful that a solution, right, to misinformation or disinformation may be beyond us as individuals. In other words, we need to think structurally about how power works, right? Who benefits from this and why? Those kind of key questions. And so I think this has been true lately. It's certainly true in the past. When you look at structures of the media, right, you mentioned, or structures of the state, or, organized institutions in some form, oftentimes they have a vested interest in whatever information it is, and they are the ones putting forward, right, these disinformation campaigns for different reasons. So, historically, we can think back to when governments go to war, right? You mentioned World War II. That's a very clear case, right, of mis or disinformation for military purposes. You can think back to when Jim Crow and segregation were rampant in the South, right? How the state, how governments perpetuated systems of power using disinformation and misinformation. And media outside the South, for example, in the United States, continued to perpetuate these stereotypes and these falsehoods, right? And, you know, again, we mentioned COVID already. So the point of the scholarship is to say, yes, it's up to us individually, but there are systems in place that perpetuate long-held historic stereotypes, you know, anti-Semitism, for example, racism, sexism, et cetera. And those are bigger issues that require bigger solutions than maybe just us as individuals being informed citizens. So, so I'll leave you with that to ponder.
So misinformation and disinformation, from my standpoint as a librarian, but also an expert in library collections, has really impacted me and in our field and in my public services or, you know, public library colleagues as well. We would hope that people would come to the library to do research, right? That's like the traditional. But often when I ask people about if they, even in my personal life, they come to me, I've researched this topic. Well, you know, I'm really interested. What have you been doing? What have you been researching? And it's often social media, it's YouTube. And there, I'm not saying there aren't advantages to some of those things, but then I, of course, would bring up, you know, what about your local library? What about some other things you could use? But I think this has impacted librarians because it is the recent discussion, and like you said, this has been going on for a while, has started a mistrust in your library and in your librarians and their choices, right? So again, I don't want to get too political, but it's, you know, we have not luckily had many problems here at University of Akron, but for many of my colleagues, book banning, book protests, and I know Tony's been doing work, you know, with that too, has had a huge impact on not only, you know, our day-to-day lives in the library, but our budgets, and it just could go on, the ripples. So it has had a huge impact on librarians and libraries.
So, Greg, you alluded to this being a key point of discussion a moment ago. What do you think are the motivating factors that contribute to mis- and disinformation in your fields and more broadly?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned, Kathy, I'm glad you mentioned the World War II and the issue of rumors, right? So just from a historical perspective, you know, I did a book a few years ago on the May 4 shootings over at Kent State, right? So I don't know if everybody's familiar with that, right? May 4, 1970, National Guardsmen fired into a crowd of protesters. 4 students were killed, 9 were wounded. It's a seminal event, not just in Kent history in Ohio, but nationally as well. And our book focused on oral history, so doing new interviews, but also going back through the many interviews that are housed at the Kent State Oral History Project there. So, and one of the things that we found a lot and realized as we listened and as we read was how rumor, right, and how it can spread and how it can be done, as you say, right, in moments of crisis and ambiguity and stress. And you know, we're filled with that now. And so one of the things, you know, we see when we look at in history and we study this is how rumor works, how it spreads. And again, it can be in a very, I say innocent, right, but not in a deliberate way, right, as you said, Gary, right, intent. It's more, you know, there's a rumor, for example, that SDS radicals are in Kent and they're going to put LSD in the water for everybody to take, right? Now, that would have been an interesting experiment had it actually been true, but of course it was completely ridiculous, right? But again, it spread through town on campus. You know, there were rumors that, you know, students had, you know, guns, you know, stashed in their room and they were going to come through Kent and start killing people. There were rumors that people in town had guns and they were going to go to campus and start shooting students, right? All these different things. But the point is that, you know, these rumors start because of fear, because of ambiguity, because of stress. And they start and they spread in ways that can reinforce people's beliefs, right, or feelings, right? It makes sense to you because it makes your world make sense, right? to say that, the government's doing X, whether it is or not, people spread that and believe it truthfully and honestly, right? They may not be spreading it just to be disinformation. They might actually believe this. And that's another thing when we think about with oral history as well, it's taught me, is that people can have a truth that's true to them, even if it might not be factually correct, right? So again, corroboration of things. In other words, just to give you another example from the Kent book, there was an interviewee who insisted that he was located in one particular spot, right, on the Commons area there when the shooting started, and he walked through it and said, no, I was here. But in fact, you look at the photographs and everything else, he was, many, many yards away. It wasn't anywhere near that. But again, for him, he believed that. It was a true for him. And, we've had similar, historical examples of this. So again, I think people, how and why they spread it, it's complicated. But one of the reasons, I think, is because one is just your memory works in certain ways and you spread it this way. But part of it, I think, is about reinforcement of, held beliefs, truths to you, whether they're wrong or right. But you hold them so strongly and you want to do that. Part of it is also, with rumors, is to be a person who has some kind of authority, right? You want to look like you know something, and that gives you cachet, it gives you power within your community, within your group, to say, well, I know this, or this, that, or the other. So part of it is, again, kind of back to power a little bit. Part of it is about your own beliefs and fears. Again, those could be innocent, those could be nefarious, right? They could be, hopeful, they could be ugly, but whatever they are, it builds on those needs and those fears. So I think for me, just looking at oral history, it's kind of shown me a lot about that aspect. So I'll pass it along. Anybody else wants that?
Yeah, I would probably just echo what Greg has said. I think that, again, there's nothing nefarious about it, and it doesn't mean people aren't sort of doing the best they can in that moment. I think just as humans, this has been shown by a ton of research, we are constantly just trying to make sense of the world, right? Like, you go out into the world every day, you're bombarded by information, or you don't have enough information, or, your senses are just overloaded. And even in situations where we're not talking about rumor or misinformation, you're just putting the pieces together. I mean, that's what your brain is doing every single day. And in situations where you're stressed out, where the situation's ambiguous, you try even harder to create a complete picture where maybe there isn't one. So I think a lot of the motivation is it's a process that we use every day to make sense of our world. It's just that in this particular situation, maybe we have too much information, not enough information, the wrong kinds of information. And that's getting harder as we are bombarded by information sources. So I think it just jives with human psychology. And particularly when it comes to the self, right? Like, we all have a really firm sense of who we are. And when we're confronted with information that contradicts that, or when we're confronted with information that maybe just doesn't jive, as Greg was saying, with your long-held beliefs, your tendency is to ignore it or to incorporate it, but only a little bit. There's all kinds of interesting studies on who believes rumor, why they believe it, or who believes misinformation and why they believe it. And people are always trying to find individual differences, right? So do your political leanings determine whether or not you're going to believe misinformation? Does your susceptibility to this or that, you know what I mean? Like, people are always trying to figure this out, but what it comes down to is it tends to be much more situational. And almost everybody rejects information that doesn't jive with their sense of self. So as an example, one of the common findings in social psychology is that almost everybody has some sense of unconscious or subconscious or implicit racism, almost everybody. You give folks a test of implicit racism, almost everybody will. Whether or not what it's actually showing as racism is up for debate, but generally people will endorse stereotypes at a subconscious level or racist beliefs at a subconscious level. We've always struggled in the field of social psych to sort of, how do you bring that information back to the person who took that test? because no one believes it, right? And I don't think they're rejecting it. I think it really is just so counter to who they believe they are that they can't assimilate that information into their sense of self, right? And I think the same is true sometimes. I think I do this. I mean, maybe that question is sort of coming, but when I see something that, probably usually on social media, when I see something that sort of counters my own political beliefs, I just go, that can't be true. I don't go look it up. I just go, that can't be true. And I move on and whatever. And that has been more commonly my experience, is that later I go, oh, shit, that thing was true. You know? And not the opposite, where I spread misinformation, but I refuse to believe something that doesn't sit well with me. So I think it's the same social psychological process, but just in the reverse. So the motivations are, I mean, I think I'm echoing what Greg said. I think it can be really hard for people to put in the legwork when it's not something that sits well with them.
Is it, just a question for you, isn't it, sorry, here, what I've learned, I'll ask the psychologist here, isn't it also true that we respond better, more positively to more negative information, right? Or things that make us scared or react to them, I guess, right, in a different way than we do positive information, right? More strongly in that way. Kind of that instinct, right, of fight or flight in the human psyche. Is that something that in psychology, am I getting that right, or am I totally mashing?
Yeah, I think if I understand what you're saying, I think so. I think I only learned about this during 2020, and I'm not sure if it's that we respond more positively to negative things as much as we pay attention to them. Yeah, so if you're, remember the way that you took in the pandemic, right? When there was good news, people kind of went, meh. When there was bad news, you heard about it every day from the time you woke up until the time you went to bed, right?
Negative campaign ads work.
Yes, and they knew this, and they knew this in the Second World War. They did this whole study on newspaper headlines, yes, and basically found that, the more negative the headline, the more people were going to buy the paper, and so we've been doing it ever since, successfully, if you want to call it that.
So kind of going off of a couple points that were made a moment ago from the world of education, we often say that it's a constructivist world. And constructivism is a theory in educational work. And it doesn't relate to the Russian art movement. It is constructivism in the sense of how people construct their understanding of the world, how they construct knowledge. And, back in time, it used to be considered that people, when they were born in this world, they were just like a blank slate. You just throw stuff in that noggin and they learn that way. But now it's more, everybody has a sense of the world and a sense of understanding of the world. And we construct our knowledge in this way. So anytime new information is given to us, we may apply it to what we already know in an appropriate way or not an appropriate way, depending on all of these other factors. So in education, we always try to tap into, okay, where are these students coming from? What is their understanding of the world or the science concept at the moment? And where might those preconceptions be? And how, as a teacher, do I address them to help change make some sort of conceptual change or their understanding of the world. So that's kind of where I went with that.
Melanie, did you have anything to add on that?
I'm good, just for the sake of time. Yes.
All right. Next, is the microphone working okay, John? Can everyone hear me okay? We can hear you. Okay, got it. I'll try and speak up for the live stream. For all of you, have you or your students fallen for mis or disinformation lately? And if so, what was the misinformation and how did you go about finding accurate information?
I'll start. It's kind of a silly story, but it was pretty recent. I'm going on my social media and I'm looking at, various videos, and it was a certain British talk show and a guest who I thought highly of, and she said this thing about Peter Pan, the book, and the idea of the name Wendy did not exist before Peter Pan came out, the book. And at first I was like, oh, and I really just share with my partner various video clips and such, and I was about to send it to him, and I'm like, oh, this is interesting in terms of, oh, the name Wendy never existed before Peter Pan. And just as I was about to hit the button, I'm like, wait a minute. Is that right? So I went ahead and I tried to look around, and it is not true. The book, Peter Pan may have popularized the name Wendy. It did exist in literature prior to that. So a silly story, but I just caught myself, and it is always kind of that shame and embarrassment. It's like, oh, I should have known better. But at least this time, I can't say always, I stopped myself. But again, going back to the classroom, part of what I do in my methods classes is really try to tap into students and where they're coming from, what are their preconceptions, how can I understand their prior knowledge, and build in activities to help them question certain things. Sometimes, I forget who said it earlier, we have these ideas about the world that work perfectly well. Why do I need to change my idea when the one I already have makes total sense? So how do I help with that conceptual change? And this can be related to all sorts of things, including miscommunication.
I don't know if I have a specific example other than to kind of go back to what I was saying before, where I just refuse to believe things that don't sit with my politics usually. And one of the things that I have done that's kind of strange is I have one of those Google Home things. And so when I get up in the morning and I say, "Good morning, Google," it now plays me 4 different versions of the news. And some of them are not the news I would normally listen to, but it's kind of neat. I recommend it. It's a fun experiment, because if you listen to Fox News tell what happened the day before, and then you listen to NPR tell you what happened the day before, you get 2 very different stories, and then you get curious, right? And you want to know more. So I don't know if I have a specific example of something I've disbelieved or that I have spread or believed or whatever, as much as my just general disbelief of things that don't fit, and that I think has helped me a little bit.
And I couldn't think of anything. When did it? I don't know. I can't think of anything personal. So not that I'm hiding anything. I'm just like, I don't know. Probably. But yeah, in terms of students, I don't have anything specific other than kind of the things I've talked about, which is presenting information, again about U.S. history or whatever it is in Ohio history. In a way that maybe opens their eyes a little bit, or things they didn't know before, kind of added in. Some of those things might, as you say, might challenge where they are, right? Although I find students tend to be a little more cynical these days, so maybe they're not surprised by anything. Yeah, we already knew that. Whatever, that's not a big deal. But I think that's just kind of what, like you were saying, Gary, about in education, right? In some ways it's about reinforcing, but I think it's also more about challenging, right? Pushing things beyond where you are to someplace new, right? Giving you new ideas, new perspectives that might make you uncomfortable. And that's what we're supposed to do, right? We're supposed to do that. And so I think that's kind of one of the things I've tried to do with these issues is to kind of see where you are and then say, well, have you looked at this, or have you thought about that, or what about this piece of evidence, et cetera, and continue to kind of challenge them in that way that makes it, in a comfortable space, right? Not to make them look stupid or anything like that, but at least, but in a way to say, well, maybe we should think about it this way, right? Change that perspective a little bit. And so that's kind of how I've approached it, just in general when I teach. So, yeah.
I've had quite a few instances where people in my life, whether it's in the classroom or at the library, come to me with information that, again, is I don't believe that. Right? I've never heard that. Where did that come from? But I try to tamp that part of me down when I'm interacting with them, because my first thing isn't to, but actually them. It's to try to understand where they're coming from. So I found it really effective to listen and to take that information and then try to go find I don't know if there is an answer, right? But where is it something in between the two things that we're thinking, and the kind of polar opposites of whatever subject we're talking about? Most of the time in my personal life, it's a friend who's very much on the other end of the spectrum that I am on things about like Meghan Markle or anything out there, right? Like I could talk for hours about our discussions about that and Kate and anyway, but what I usually do with her is find neutral. It could be Reuters, it could be Associated Press, something that we both trust, if that makes sense. If I get too far into MSN, CNN territory, she's never going to listen. And if she gets too far into Joe Rogan and some other things that she listens to, Joe Rogan is like the most normal of the things she listens to, that it will get to a space where we can't understand each other. So I try to find kind of neutral ground, and I just kind of very gently send her things. And sometimes it means that I was wrong, right? Or not wrong, but I was kind of down the wrong track and she was on the right track. But sometimes it means that, she takes a look at that and she's like, well, I'm going to rethink about that subject, or I'm going to try to be a little bit better at kind of vetting what I'm listening to and what I'm not sure if it works for either one of us, because like you said, Kathy, sometimes I hear things and I'm like, I just don't believe it. But I'm trying really hard, and I want to keep this person in my life, right? So that it comes down to that too, right? That you want to keep your friends and your students and the people around you like still in conversation with you and not give up on each other. If that makes sense.
All right, so at this point, we're going to go ahead and turn over to audience questions. Folks can raise their hands, and please make sure I can bring the mic to you before you start shouting out your questions. But I already see one hand right here. One moment.
I'm loud, yeah.
Oh, that's all right. Just so the live stream picks it up.
Can disinformation, misinformation turn into information, right? Have you seen where something that was pushed around and everybody's like, no, 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 turn into fact at some point? And if you have, I'd love to hear some examples there.
Sorry, we're all just looking at each other like, that was a really good question, because we don't have an answer. It's weird. Academics are quiet. Yeah, I was just trying to think historically, like, can I think off the top of my head something like that? Certainly, I'm trying to go back in my brain as quickly as I can, but I imagine, there's, I guess, I don't know, I'll have to think. But it's a really good point. In other words, something that started as a rumor, right? Probably something like pop culture or whatever, oh, they're not, doing this or that, or an athlete, oh, they're not going to, leave this team or that team, right? And you kind of hear these things, and then, slowly the news comes out, and eventually, oh, wait, that actually is true, right? They are going to do this or they are going to do that. So that's kind of just in a general sense that I'm trying to think of. But give me some time as we go forward. I'll come up with something. But that's a really good question. Kathy, you might have something.
Well, I think the question is tricky because almost always, okay, I might be overstating that, frequently, rumors have a kernel of truth to begin with. Misinformation has a kernel of truth to begin with. And, spoken like a true social scientist, I don't think things are just true or false, right? Like there's always just sort of this continuum, and what you're saying speaks to that. So like one of the most common rumors during the Second World War was about, the common theme of rumors during the Second World War was about government corruption. So they're asking everybody to ration, grow your victory gardens, do this, do that, don't use gas. Meanwhile, senators are driving around on pleasure cruises and blah, blah, blah. And really what they found because they analyzed thousands of rumors during the Second World War. Almost all of the rumors that spread well actually had some kernel of truth to them. Yes, there was definitely, senators out on pleasure cruises. Were they, doing this every single day? Were they driving? Probably not, right? So usually when you find those cases, I think, when you find those cases where misinformation later comes out to be true, it's more like, yeah, it was kind of true, but like this was still exaggerated, or this was this, or this was that. So I think the question's hard because I think misinformation usually has some kind of kernel of truth, which is the other reason we have to be I think it's important to be empathetic and kind when people are sort of stating things that they think are true when there's misinformation, because there is usually some kernel of truth there. And when I talk, we talk about this a lot in our museum, right? There's a lot of myths about mental illness, for example, and we talk in our museum about mental illness. And people come in, they have these ideas about it, and when it comes down to it, it's like they've had one experience and there's this kernel of truth. And I think it's important to kind of acknowledge that and then, move forward from there and go, that's a legitimate thing that you think, and I can see why you think that, and then you kind of move on, because it's not true or false. None of these things are usually true or false. It's sort of like there's some truth to that, but depending how far down the chain it's gone and how many times it's been distorted, it's no longer just the same thing. So I think sort of something that was false becoming true is a bit of a misnomer, if that makes sense. Gary, did you want to?
That sounds good to me.
All right.
Good job. Good question.
In terms of the origins of things that are untrue that then get spread, you were talking about, Kathy, I think you were the person mainly talking about this. You were talking about ordinary psychological processes, ways that we learn about the world, and that they sometimes yield true beliefs and they sometimes yield what later turn out to be false beliefs, or maybe mixed beliefs where there's some elements of truth and some elements of falsehood. And when you say that in this room and in this museum, I think a little bit about heuristics and biases. So I teach in the philosophy department, and so we have if you teach logic or critical thinking, there's something that's called informal fallacies. So formal fallacies would be like, logically that does not follow from that. There's the problem there in the reasoning. Informal fallacies are things that I think people rely on a lot that are heuristically valuable, but they just don't guarantee the truth of the conclusion. So like an example of one would be, consider the source. So you say something like, well, that's not true, look who said it. And it used to be back in the day, in a better time, it would be like, George W. Bush said that, you can't believe that. Now we've moved on. And people would say, wait a second, actually he was correct. That was not false. It seems to me, like to kind of be continuous with Kathy's point a little bit, that we ought to get better at recognizing when our belief-generating mechanisms are most likely to be reliable and when they're most likely to result in us taking on something that's untrue and spreading it as if it's true. And I was just wondering if I guess this is mostly directed at Kathy, if there is psychological research or if there are ways of helping people recognize, hey, this is where you ought to be a little bit more careful because this is where you're liable to, pick up some rumor or just some factoid and then it hasn't really been checked and so forth. I mean, because otherwise, if we're just letting our native abilities to make sense of the world rule everything, we're going to be constantly taking on all kinds of false beliefs, spreading them and so forth. But if we could get better at recognizing when that's most likely to be a problem, then maybe we could do a better job. You could do a better job of educating people too in classes and so forth. So I was just wondering if you knew much about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because kind of what I was saying before is we really haven't found, there's been a ton of research on this, and especially there's been a ton of funding for research on this in the last 4 years, and because of that, there's just been an explosion of research on individual factors in rumor, or in belief in misinformation, and then spread. So who's going to believe it, who's going to spread it, and under what circumstances. And honestly, the results have been really mixed. And there's some advice coming out from psychologists in these reports that are now being issued just in this past year. But if you read it, you'll find that almost under every statement they have the caveat, but findings are mixed, but findings are mixed. The one thing that seems to be true, and we knew this in the 40s, and the research is showing it again, is it comes down to motivation. We somehow have to find ways to motivate people to not want to believe false information and not spread it. And we don't know how to do that yet, but that seems to be the thing. So one of the most common ways over the last 100 years of combating misinformation is through debunking and pre-bunking. So pre-bunking is the idea, well, this might be something that will get spread. This might be a piece of misinformation. Let's kind of tell people it's not true before they even hear it. But debunking has been more common, where you just restate the rumor and then you analyze it and state the facts. That only works if people are motivated, though, because what happens, they find, is people just read the misinformation again and don't read anymore. And then it actually sometimes can lead to, yes, yeah. So basically it's like this in almost everything in psychology, right? Unless people are motivated to make a change, it's not gonna happen, so.
And I think you really have to know yourself to know your weak points, right? And a lot of people don't want to examine their own inherent biases. And, I feel like I know myself enough to know where my danger zones are, but not everyone is going to look that far into themselves or cares, right, to do that. So I think that has a lot to do with it as well, and the mixed findings, yeah.
Hi, Melanie was the first person up there who said, but I don't think she was the only one, that you encounter people who say, do your own research, or I did my own research. So we talk about this all the time in my house, and so this question is sort of directed maybe at you, Melanie, and Gary. How do we, as academics in the scholarly community, convince our students, convince others that research and selective reading are not the same thing?
Oh, yeah, that's true. I was just thinking, about my history degree, though, right? So I was an English and history major in undergrad. So that's where I learned, right, was in high school and then in undergrad what those two things meant. But it was a different world, right? I'm old enough that I didn't have Facebook and Instagram and all of that stuff coming at me. And I try to do this with my own kids, because that's really the only, and people that come to ask me questions, I try to kind of steer them the same way. But I'm not really sure if I have a great answer for that, other than just trying to show them. And, especially if I know they're students here at UA, I know they're going to be shown in the classroom as well. But it does come back to personal choice again, and whether they want to hear what you're saying, or gently trying to guide them to, I think.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So not also sure that I'm answering your questions, but in terms of working with my students who are learning to be teachers and trying to address not only content standards, but also instructional technology standards. So how do we appropriately use technology in our instruction, and also have our students use it in a safe way, appropriate way, going to primary sources. So that is part of what I need to do as an instructor in my teaching. And I was thinking earlier about how I used to do that. In the old days, we would send them to these websites that looked really legitimate. But you had to look really closely. And one of my favorites is it's all about the endangered Pacific Northwest tree octopus. And there's a picture. If you look real close, you might see a little fishing line, but it's like, oh, this is the tree octopus and blah, blah, blah. And so how do we, that one seems pretty obvious to some, not always everybody. The other one that's a real classic is the dangers of dihydrogen monoxide. Very dangerous. If it's a solid, it can cause tissue damage. If it's a gas, it can scald you. So people don't always realize, oh, it's H2O, it's just water, but it looks legitimate. I think nowadays with AI, though, in terms of doing, artificial intelligence, doing research sometimes is plugging it into a bot. And I how do you know what's real or what's not real? And I was thinking about, sometimes looking at the paper and they have those quizzes. It's like, is that picture of Kathy real or AI generated? It's like, I don't know. It looks real, but nope, it's AI generated. So it's just, how do we know what is real or not anymore? So I guess I'll just leave it at that.
Well, thanks, Gary.
I think we have time for one more quick question in the back.
So it seems to me that one of the big problems with this is people's fear of being wrong. So I think my question is, how do we as academics, educators, and democratic citizens foster a healthy culture of wrongness, and not only with ourselves, but the people around us?
Well, I was thinking earlier about, the culture of academia, in terms of scientists and scientists doing their work. And it's like publish or die. And sometimes you have to publish, even though there might be mistakes. And there's been a gentleman in the last couple of years, Sholto David, and his main leaning in life is to look at scientific peer-reviewed papers in journals and find all the cut and paste, scientists taking images and cut and pasting them, turning them a little bit, so they could get things published. I mean, there's a lot of issues here, but they're trying to get things published. They are getting published. So there's like a culture of change I think needs to happen before we get rid of that.
There's, I think, plenty of ways to foster a sense of it's okay when things change. And I actually think, I promise I'm not just like plugging us here, but I think history and museums are a really wonderful way to get people to see, or to get them to engage with the idea that knowledge just changes over time, right? And that's the nature of science. That's the nature of, it's the nature of knowledge, right? I would hope that we're constantly we're not, not necessarily, but we're constantly changing our ideas. We're constantly improving. We're constantly going, oh, wow, that was wrong. Let's have a better version of that, and I think that museums actually can show you this. They can, and engaging with history can show you this, that the nature of history is change. And change often means changing your ideas and changing your mind. And it's one of the things that we always try to do here. I think we did it sort of unconsciously, and now it's part of kind of our values and our mission, is to say a museum is a space where people can come and comfortably engage with ideas that are unfamiliar to them, that counter things that they already believe, and that show you that, things just change all the time and change is okay. So that would be my answer. I think one of the great ways is through engaging with these kinds of ideas in these cultural spaces.
Yeah, it's a good question, Jason. Thanks. Yeah, I'll piggyback on Kathy. I think, we're academics, right? So we've got kind of a captive audience here in our classrooms. The issue, I think, is how do we get outside the walls and, out there in the public? And so I think it's important, places like museums, which draw the public in, they're unofficial learners, they're voluntary learners. So creating spaces that are challenging but safe, right? Challenging but comfortable to come in and encounter something new, something different, and be okay with that, right? Social media is not good at that, right? It's about creating clicks and amplifying extremes, and there's no point in arguing with anybody on Facebook because I don't think anybody's ever won that argument. If you have, let me know. Anyway, but so finding those spaces wherever they are, if it's museums, but also maybe civic spaces, right? Creating them, maintaining them, having them there for people to engage in these things is important. I'm not sure the media is doing a very good job of that. Some are, some aren't. But maybe it's down to local organizations, different civic groups that can do this type of thing, like a museum or whatever it might be. So in my mind, I think it's getting academics out, right, of their zone here into public spaces, wherever those might be, to have forums like this, right, where we can reach the public, where we can have a space to discuss, to talk, to encounter ideas that might be challenging or different, but do that in a way where we can, have that kind of time, because it takes time, right? It's not something that's going to be quick, but have it in a way that where we can do it in a way where we're not shouting at each other, right, or worse. It's not easy, right, and we're seeing those spaces are few and far between maybe and hard to create, but I think we need to create them. We need to figure out how to do that. That's what back to my original point about big structures, right? This is a big problem. This is not a you and I individual problem, although we can do it, But so your question, I think, kind of comes back to that, is creating those spaces like a museum, whatever it might be. That's what I would say.
And I'll make it brief because I know we're running out of time. I have worked really hard to just normalize saying that I'm wrong. Right? When I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I apologize if I need to. And I try to model that in my life and the people I work with and the people in my life and the people that I teach, so that it's seen as something that's okay. But because for a long time in my life, I was brought up and raised to not be wrong. It's not good to be wrong. You look weak, you look, ABC. But it's been a big part of my life, the last 10 to 15 years, I'd say, to just really be comfortable when saying I'm wrong. And it happens.
Occasionally, right?
All right, we are a couple minutes after, so I want to take a moment to thank our 4 panelists for this insightful discussion.
And thank you, Tony, very much.
Before y'all go, I want to quickly and shamelessly plug a couple upcoming events at the Cummings Center. Next week, on October 10th at 3 p.m., we will be hosting a virtual lecture. I should say I will be hosting a virtual lecture on LGBTQ plus history in Sexology magazine. It's a tie-in with our current exhibition happening upstairs, Sexology, Science, and Sensationalism. Also on October 23rd, we will be hosting an opening reception for our newest exhibit, Art as Therapy. That exhibit explores the history and practice of art therapy with a specific focus on Ohio's role in that history. That will be October 23rd from 5 to 6.